Hi, everyone. My name is Ellie Olsen, and my Keystone is titled Improving Training in Post-Assault Treatment for Gender Diverse Survivors with the help of Dr. Shannon Peters. I performed a qualitative study of key documents from these treatment centers to evaluate their capacity to treat diverse survivors, particularly transgender and non-binary. To begin, I want to give you a little bit of context about why I chose this work specifically. This is known as the Health Impact Pyramid and describes how interventions on various levels impact different proportions of a population. So on this bottom reddish tier, impacting something like housing policy will affect huge portions of the population versus something smaller like the yellow tier of individual counseling or education impacts things much less, but affects people all the same. So for this Keystone, we're in this green tier of clinical interventions, and talking a little bit about why I chose this. We are in a society where there's a lot of discrimination and persecution of trans and non-binary individuals. So until we can kind of get rid of the need for post-assault interventions, we can at least make sure that they're the best possible care. Gender diverse individuals experience sexual assault in their lifetime at a rate of 47%, which varies between specific identities, as you can see here, but that is more than 4 times the rate for cisgender individuals. This is also intersectional with racial and ethnic minority identities, as well as disability and low socioeconomic status. So those individuals have a tendency to experience lifetime sexual assault at much higher proportions. This disparity in discrimination is reinforced when they go seek justice and care from professional spaces, and so that's where this project comes in, is trying to eliminate that so we can begin to close that disparity gap, or at least mitigate the effects. There's a consensus nationwide that care is not adequately, and at least not consistently, meeting the needs of transgender and gender diverse survivors. For these individuals, we found from research studies and needs assessments that there's a specific heightened need for use of correct pronouns, preferred names, and professionalism in conversations about their bodies, their anatomy, and their sexual activity and partners. What hasn't been researched quite as much is, do the treatment centers that they seek out provide this? If not, what are they lacking and what do they need to improve? I worked with these 5 centers across the state of Massachusetts, but primarily focused in Boston to attempt to answer that question. I used their training requirements, their training content, both video and printed, their client intake forms, treatment materials, mission statements, and values, and compared them both to each other as well as against current standards of care to synthesize a really comprehensive standard of where we should be at and how to move from our current point of the field to that standard. My document analysis led me in 2 primary directions. Inclusivity can be a function of behaviors and practices used in direct client care, but it can also be a product of the policies and procedures that are put in place more behind the scenes. So the first category of recommendations that I have come up with is provider behavior. So encouraging providers to use best practices like active listening and employing skills of humility and sensitivity when talking to trans survivors who often have a very different experience than they themselves do. Client-informed practices use their client cues to facilitate their practices. So that includes, taking a cue from someone on how they want to be approached and referred to and how they want the actual session to run. They also use feedback-based improvement systems to modify their care as needed based on their client's feedback. This last point here, inclusivity in a physical environment, lends itself well to a visual here. So it involves moving more from this neutral kind of sterile space we often see in treatment spaces to one of really overt inclusivity and intentional welcoming of trans and non-binary individuals into the spaces. It also involves things like all-gender restrooms and use of other accommodations around restrooms, which are a traditionally sensitive space. So we want just really clear visual welcoming for individuals that may feel unwelcome in spaces like this. Moving into policies and procedures, these are really critical in how care can manifest for a client, but this client might not actually ever explicitly know that these policies and procedures are even in place. So talking a little bit about more of this behind the scenes work and what can be done to affect the care without being so necessarily showy about it. So standardizing provider knowledge of experience involves in training, standardizing a curriculum to ensure that all providers are receiving information about some nuances of what it means to be trans and the trans experience, as well as some challenges that are traditionally faced by gender diverse survivors. These next two kind of go together. So priorities and training materials, what I mean by that is really just what concepts are included and how time is allotted and how the training is physically structured to include all of the necessary information. And these priorities should really reflect what is written in the organization's tenets of care, which often comes from mission statements and values. So every organization that I worked with had really, really clear emphasis on their welcoming of diversity and their inclusion, but in their trainings themselves, it wasn't always quite as clear that this was the priority. So matching those two and ensuring that they're cohesive can be a really easy transition into better care. So finally, I'd like to give you an example for this last category of language used in provider materials. So this first example, where does the client receive his or her ongoing medical and mental health care? I think this is a pertinent example because gender really is not involved in the answering of this question at all. So you don't need to know someone's gender to know, what facility or what location their care is coming from. And this same document actually encourages this, does a really great job of switching to there later in the document. So kind of unifying that and making it one holistic piece can be really important because including something like his or her encourages the provider actually to adopt that binary mindset, even if it's subconscious. And that's something we really want to work on avoiding for just the best treatment of diverse individuals that we possibly can. So just as part of my conclusion, I would like to talk about the care that these organizations and the intention that they put into providing care for clients. They do a really amazing job, and Boston especially is a great place and a really progressive city to receive care like this, but they were also so very excited to have an opportunity to learn and grow. So I'm really excited and honored that I can get back to them with a direction to do that, but I think it's important to note that they do a whole lot of great work already. Thank you.
Lovely work, Ellie. What was the impression from these different organizations about what you were doing? So, and what was their response? Did they think there was a need? Were they excited, and were they excited to learn from each other?
Yeah, absolutely. Most organizations were really excited, and I found that actually one of the biggest barriers for them participating and one of their kind of hesitant points is that there's just not a lot of bandwidth in these organizations to give time and energy to a project like this. So I think they were particularly excited that as a student I got excited about it and could put my time and resources and then use Kilachand's time and resources to put towards that. But yeah, I got a lot of really excited responses, and even from people who couldn't participate, everyone was like, please send, please send. So yeah, that was exciting. Yeah.
Thanks, that was fascinating. I have a question that kind of has two parts. One is that, was the training that you're talking about or advocating for or recommending, is it something that everyone would receive even if they're already working there, or is it primarily something that people who are now being trained are receiving? And one of the questions behind the question is I was thinking that a lot of what you're talking about would be really applicable to, a university too, where, and I'm a tenured professor with no intention of leaving my job, but so I'm just kind of thinking about ongoing trainings as opposed to one's training just for the people who are going through the process of being certified or educated now.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the biggest limitations actually is that I was kind of at the mercy of these centers and what they sent to me. So most of what I received was new onboarding materials, but it's absolutely something I can go back to them and say this should be continued training, and if it's not already, because I think this particularly is such an evolving subject and we have such a dynamic population. And that's kind of where this idea came from. Gender diversity is relatively recent as a concept, and especially like widespread and really known. So I think that there's definitely included, the people that are already there should be included in training. Yeah.
Great job, Ellie.
Thank you.
One of the things that strikes me about your project is that it's such a careful and subtle reading of these documents, and so focused on the importance and the knowledge that words matter. And I wonder, based on your own experience in doing this, whether you think about your own analysis of this, like you with the documents, how you think about including gender diverse individuals and particularly survivors in discussions about these documents, like when you're going forward and thinking about who are the constituents here, and especially based on what you just said in response to Professor Henchman's question, that this is an evolving, not only set of phenomena, but an evolving language, evolving discourse around identities and issues and gender diversity. So how do you think about incorporating the particular constituents involved in ongoing document analysis and training programs along these lines?
Yeah. And actually, the Fenway Health Center does a really great job of including diverse individuals and recruiting diverse individuals on their team. So that's an issue we see a lot too with, racial and all kinds of identities, is that our providers are not as diverse as their clients, as their patients. So I think in sort of an industry sense, we want to be recruiting more diverse individuals and using incentive programs or other forms of encouragement to get diverse people into leadership positions. But also, those needs assessments that I mentioned were really critical in at least the Fenway Health's their practices. So they use a lot of that data, and they run one almost every year. So including those would be really great for everybody. Yeah, thank you.